This week we look at Dracula and the real person he was inspired by, Vlad the Impaler. But first, shout out to my favorite vampire stories, being Human, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Cirque du Freak, Underworld, and shout out to my favorite vampire ever, Lenore from Supernatural. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things at least a little bit dark. From deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes. This month we are doing our creepy countdown to Halloween with extra spooky topics. So if this is your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. Vlad Tepes, better known as Vlad the Impaler, was born in 1431 in a place called Transylvania, which is in current-day Romania. He was the second of 4 sons. His father was Vlad II Dracula, a name which he acquired after being inducted into an order made up of elite aristocracy and monarchs who promised to defend Christianity and protect it, especially from the Ottoman Empire. The name of the group was the Order of the Dragon, and Dracula, although means devil in Romanian today, came from the Latin word Draco, which meant, as you can guess, dragon. Later, Vlad III, or Vlad the Impaler, would come to adopt the nickname Dracula, which can be interpreted as Son of the Dragon. When Vlad was about 5 years old, his father became the head, or voivode, of Wallachia, which is just next door to Transylvania. To keep the two straight, I will call the father Vlad Dracula and Vlad the Impaler by his Romanian name, Vlad Tepes. The region at the time faced a lot of pressure from Christian Hungary to the west and the Muslim Ottoman Empire to the south. In 1442, Vlad Dracula, who apparently wasn't liked by his noble subjects, called the Boyar, ousted him from power, and Hungary, who was supposed to be his ally, stood by and did nothing. You can imagine that Vlad Dracula felt betrayed, and that he wasn't restored to his position with the help of Hungary. He was basically hung out to dry. Vlad Dracula, abandoned by Hungary, did an about-face and traveled with his children to the Ottoman Empire to form an alliance with the Sultan. The ruler of the Ottoman Empire at the time was Murad II, and when Vlad Dracula arrived, he and his 2 sons were immediately detained. Vlad Dracula and Murad II were able to form an alliance, but Murad II would only let Vlad Dracula leave and return to Wallachia if he were to leave his 2 detained children behind, as a sign of good faith between the two. Vlad was 11 years old at the time, and over the next 5 years, he was tutored in all the necessary subjects for an aristocrat. But Vlad Tepes didn't enjoy his time with the Ottomans. In fact, he grew a deep-seated hatred for his captors. His brother, on the other hand, Radu, would end up being loyal to the Ottomans. In November 1447, Vlad Dracula, along with his oldest son, were assassinated on the orders of the voivode of Transylvania, and Vlad Dracula's second cousin, Vladislav II, was placed on the throne of Wallachia. Now, this is where Vlad III Tepes, nicknamed Dracula, would enter the world scene and remain familiar to this day. At only 16 years old, Vlad Tepes returned to his homeland Wallachia and quickly won the throne. But with enemies, the Boyars, the Ottomans, and his younger brother who was loyal to the Ottomans, his first reign was extremely short. It was only 2 months before the throne was returned to Vladislav. But Vlad Tepes was not going to give up. Over the next 8 years, he fought for the throne, and it came to a head in 1456, when the two came face to face. It was decided that the 2 men, Vladislav and Vlad Tepes, would fight, like actually physically fight, and the winner would rule. Spoiler alert, Vlad Tepes won. And with that, a tyrant, was born. At the very least, a legend was born. Trigger warning for those who are squeamish. Some of Vlad's first targets for his bloodlust were the boyars, or the aristocrats that killed his father and brother. He invited them all to a banquet, expecting that they would use it as an opportunity to kill him. He shockingly had them all stabbed to subdue them, and then had them impaled, which is where his famous name comes from. And horrifyingly, the people who were impaled were still alive. They were not executed and then impaled. No. They were impaled as their execution. I literally cannot go into even more detail because although I am a morbid person, I don't do gore. So if you're interested in knowing exactly what that was, you do you. It's only a quick Google search away. But let's just say that depending on how much Vlad Tepes hated you, determined what kind of impalement you were sentenced to, and different methods meant different amounts and lengths of suffering. It's obvious that Vlad the Impaler's enemies would be enraged by this kind of treatment, but it disgusted his allies as well. I mean, it's hard to be friendly with someone capable of such over-the-top violence. In 1459, it was a bloody year for Wallachia. Vlad had Saxon merchants impaled for their prior alliances with the boyars, not to mention that when the Ottomans sent diplomatic envoys to meet with Vlad Tepes, they were asked to remove their hats. The men politely declined because it was against their religion. So Vlad, quote, commended them on their religious devotion and ensured that their hats would forever remain on their heads by having their hats nailed to the diplomats' skulls. As you can imagine, the story spread far and wide, and with Vlad the Impaler, it's hard to know which are true and which are just stories. One story says that after a particularly bloody battle, Vlad Tepes ate his dinner in the forest while surrounded by enemy soldiers, still alive, crying and moaning, impaled on poles. It is said that he dipped his bread in the blood of his victims. The consumption of blood is an idea that would live on tied to his legend. One of his most famous acts was when he had 20,000 bodies impaled outside his town as a repellent of sorts. The bodies were rotting and being eaten by crows when the Ottomans arrived, and were so entirely disgusted by what they were seeing that they turned and went back home. He also had a fondness for burning people, alive of course. It is said that he invited a whole group of beggars from his town, fed them a grand feast, before locking them in the building and having his guards burn it to the ground, saying that they were useless to humanity. Other stories include people being burned alive and then having their bodies force-fed to their loved ones. He was also known to have the skin removed from Ottoman prisoners, again, of course, while alive, then to have salt rubbed in and goats lick the salt off, since goats have rough tongues, apparently. It is hard to know where the truth ends and begins, but we all know that even in the lies there is a grain of truth. But what we do know is, however, that many of these actually did happen. But even if just one of these stories is true, it shows how incredibly depraved he was. It's a little crazy to think that he is considered a folk hero in modern-day Romania for defending them from invaders. Thankfully, Vlad did not live very long. He did not have a long life. He ended up being captured by the army of the King of Hungary and spent 12 years in prison before finally returning to Wallachia. In 1476, he was able to regain his throne for the third time before being killed in a battle just months later at the age of 45. Thank fuck for that. Now, perhaps Vlad III, Dracula, would have faded somewhat from history had it not been for a man born 400 years later. Abraham Stoker, later known as Bram Stoker, was born in Ireland in 1847. Stoker published his first book in 1890, but it is his second book that is remembered today. You already know it if you've been paying attention. Dracula. Disclaimer: It is a very, very loosely based story of Vlad the Third Dracula, but the connections cannot be ignored. The book is about an aristocrat named Dracula who lived in Transylvania and apparently needed to drain the blood of people to live. I want to jump in here and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. I am trying to make this channel my full-time job so that I can bring you even more morbid topics. I haven't reached 200 subscribers yet, so if you're morbid like me, help me grow my channel by hitting subscribe now. Every subscriber helps. Okay, let's get back to the video. So we have heard the story of Vlad Dracula, so let's take a look at Count Dracula, shall we? The book begins with an English lawyer named Jonathan Harker traveling to Transylvania to finish a property deal with a client who he has yet to meet. When he arrives, he senses that something is off, like creepily off. And when he meets the client, a Count Dracula, he is pale, thin, and just plain weird, and not in a fun way. At one point, when Harker accidentally cuts himself shaving, he is alarmed when the Count nearly attacks him. After an incident where Harker is nearly seduced by 3 women who turn out to be vampires, he then finds out that Dracula too is a vampire, an undead that can only go on by living off the blood of the living. Harker decides to try to kill the Count, but fails, and Dracula takes off, leaving Harker stuck in the castle. Dracula boards a ship for England. Coincidentally, at the same time, back in England, Mina, who is Harker's fiancée, is visiting a friend Lucy. During an episode of Sleepwalking, Lucy is bitten by a vampire herself. Mina takes care of Lucy as she becomes sick, and ends up leaving her in the care of 2 doctors, Seward and Van Helsing, of course. They attempt to treat Lucy, but all tries fail, and Lucy dies. When Jonathan finally is able to make it back to England, he talks about his experience, leading Van Helsing to conclude that Count Dracula was the one who turned Lucy, and that Lucy is probably the creature that had been attacking children in the area. To stop her, they dig up her body, put a stake through her heart, chop off her head, and put garlic in her mouth for good measure. Then they turn to taking out Dracula. Van Helsing ends up being suspicious of Mina, Harker's fiancée, so he and Seward break into her room one night. They find Harker passed out and see Mina drinking Dracula's blood. Suddenly, Dracula disappears. Figuring that he is returning to his homeland, the group follows him back to Transylvania, where they find him in a box, a coffin, where they give him the Lucy treatment. With that, he crumbles away into dust. You might think, wow, Bram Stoker was a very creative person in how he took the real-life story and imagined up a fictionalized story. But it must be mentioned that he didn't invent the legend of the vampire. Turns out that humans have had legends of vampires for thousands of years. They just look a little different from culture to culture. But almost all stories include an undead being coming back to life at night to feed off of the living people, whether it's their blood, their life force, or something else. It is possible that the legend of the vampire first arose from stories of people actually rising from the dead, when in actuality, these people were buried prematurely, and they were not fully dead yet. Just mostly dead. Reference joke, anyone? Anyway, to prevent these people from rising back to life, stakes were driven through the hearts of people before burying them. Sound familiar? Stake through the heart to kill a vampire? Cutting the head off could also prove useful for preventing the dead from rising again. A very famous movie called Nosferatu, a name familiar to SpongeBob fans, was actually ripped straight from the novel Dracula. But in hopes of avoiding a lawsuit, which, side note, did not work, the director had made some changes. One change was that vampires couldn't actually go out during the day. Not because it weakened them like it did in the book, but because the sunlight would burn and essentially cremate them. It is now a modern vampire trope, solely created by a German director in the 1920s. A much better explanation for why vampires only come out at night rather than having sparkly fucking skin. But let's not even go there. So what about other vampire tropes? Okay, garlic. Well, long before we knew what antibiotics were, people knew that garlic was very good for helping people return to health. They didn't know that it's because garlic is a very potent natural antibiotic, but they figured if a vampire could infect another through blood, then garlic could treat or prevent the vampire illness, or at least repel a vampire with its contaminated blood. Okay, what about mirrors? Well, back in the day, mirrors were pieces of glass as they are today, but then they created the reflective surface by using silver. Silver is good for protection against evil of all types. Vampires would therefore avoid the mirrors. Silver is similar to garlic and has been used to treat illness throughout history. So it's easy to see where the link comes from when you remember that throughout much of history, people thought illness was caused by evil. And, of course, the easiest link to see has to be vampires and bats. Vampires suck blood, and vampire bats suck blood. But this part of the myth is newer. We know this because the bat is named after the legend and not the other way around, but also because all 3 species of vampire bat in the world are all located in the New World. Finally, we look at the appearance of a vampire. Fangs, pallor, thin, or rather, we will next week when we cover diseases and the supernatural. So, this is where we end today's video. If you enjoyed it, you're a weirdo. But that's okay, because me too. So hit the like button and show some solidarity. If you want to see more morbid stuff, hit subscribe. And I'll see you next week. But, as always, don't forget to be merry, but stay morbid.